Welcome, everybody, to the 84th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Professor Marc Shapiro. Welcome, Professor Shapiro.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So, for those less familiar with Professor Shapiro, he holds the Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at Scranton University in Pennsylvania. He is a graduate, undergraduate graduate of Brandeis, and a PhD from Harvard. He is the author of numerous books, articles, and reviews. He has, amongst his books, are Between the Yeshiva World and Modern Orthodoxy, and also The Limits of Orthodox Theology, both of which were National Jewish Book Award finalists. Other books of his include Saul Lieberman, The Orthodox, and Studies in Maimonides and His Interpreters. And then he also regularly publishes scholarly articles on the Sfarim blog. So this brings us also to another of his works, which brings us to our topic of this episode, which is Changing the Immutable, How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History, which presents fascinating research, amongst many things, into censorship in Orthodox publishing, including our specific topic today. So, Professor Shapiro. So we have, the topic under discussion is really one key rabbinic responsum, right? That of Rabbi Moshe Isserles. And it was actually his number 124, in which Professor Shapiro wrote in this book. It is one of the most famous examples of halachic censorship. So that's a lot. It sounds like there's a lot of examples. I mean, you wrote an entire book on examples of censorship, specifically, from a more traditional or Orthodox perspective. So I guess one thing I have to ask is, more broadly, how prevalent has Orthodox censorship been?
Well, as I describe in the book, it's been quite prevalent, and I divide the book into different chapters, focusing on different themes. And one chapter deals with Halacha, Jewish law, and it's in the context of that chapter that I mention Rabbi Moshe Isserles and his well-known responsum that was censored.
And what makes this responsum of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, this number 124, what makes it so famous? You said it was one of the most famous examples.
Well, because of who the person is. For Moshe Isserles, we have the work, the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law, and it's really authored by two people, Rav Joseph Caro and Rav Moshe Isserles, who puts in the Ashkenazic rulings. So really, for traditional Jews, you don't get more important than Rav Moshe Isserles. So the fact that the great Rav Moshe Isserles would have a responsum of his censored shows the significance of what we're speaking about here, in terms of how high censorship could reach, even it's almost like to the throne, you could say, that if Rav Moshe Isserles is not safe from being censored, I dare say no one is.
Yeah, and it involves wine, which, I mean, there's an interesting contentiousness also to this topic, right? To this particular responsum.
Well, yes, because we're not, and that's the reason it's censored. We're not dealing with some sort of arcane issue from the past, or just some theoretical problem that is being discussed. We're dealing with something that was of everyday relevance, namely non-Jewish wine. Mm-hmm. So the point of censoring the responsum is precisely to have an effect on the present, as how people live their lives. The idea was to keep this position, or I should say this elaboration, I should say, of Rav Moshe Isserles from being seen. I guess that's the best way to put it.
I think we've done a great job so far of introducing and certainly teasing what the content of this, the censored text under discussion is. I think, for those less familiar with it, so this text is responsum number 124 of his. And for those less familiar, even I think this is one of the first times we've mentioned response on the show. So for those less familiar with response, it's basically someone writes a question to a rabbi and they respond. And so this, in this particular instance, Professor Shapiro, so this is his 124th, and he wrote over 120 of them, right? Yeah.
He has I'm holding the edition right here, and it goes up to 132. Rav Moshe Isserles lives in the 16th century, and the question, as it's phrased, we don't know who asked it because it's anonymous, the question, but the person wants to know if I, that is Rav Moshe Isserles, know of any basis for the practice in Moravia, you look at a map, you'll see Moravia. It's sort of look in the Czech Republic, what used to be Czechoslovakia, and you'll see Bohemia, Moravia. The practice then, and also in other places, Sharmidinoti says, to be lenient on this matter of drinking non-Jewish wine, and no one rebukes them. Do they have anything to rely upon from a halachic standpoint that these are, remember, these are regular Jews, not reformers or anything. These are traditional observant Jews. There wasn't a reform movement in the 16th century, and they are drinking non-Jewish wine, something that everyone today knows is not kosher, and yet the only people who would drink it would be people who would not identify with the observant community. And yet in the days of Moshe Isserles, this was widespread. It specifically mentions Moravia, but also other lands. Maybe later we can talk about some of the other lands. So that's the question which Moshe Isserles deals with. Can this be justified in any way?
Right. So I want to pause for context for listeners. This is a topic we've discussed previously, going back this normative prohibition against drinking Gentile wine from early rabbinic times in episode 71, featuring Professor Avram Shannon on Yein Nesech, on Gentile libation wine, and then also how this prohibition got qualified in medieval times in episode 83, featuring Professor David Friedenreich. So there's definitely rabbinic precedent going back to rabbinic times, and it sounds like, and also in the medieval rabbis were trying to qualify because they didn't have as much libation going on by Gentiles, and so this, I think it sounds like, certainly for these Moravian Jews, that they felt that, it doesn't sound like they're necessarily rabbis, that they were just sort of part of the hoi polloi, just people that figured, it's wine, right?
Well, there's two things. First of all, there's also the additional reason given. It's not clear in the Talmud how binding this is, but by medieval times it becomes very important. That is to prevent intermarriage. Mm-hmm. So even if this was wine which had nothing to do with, let's say you're not dealing with idolaters, you still would have the issue of intermarriage. Now, my feeling is that, as you suggested as well, that you deal with regular Jews. They're not necessarily rabbinic figures. They're making their own conclusions. But the fact is that this is widespread. And the question is, people are not rebuking them. So presumably the people not rebuking them would be the rabbis. Often rabbis don't rebuke because they feel that, that no one's going to listen to them. So what's the point? But we still have to account for widespread avoidance of this prohibition, which is unusual in a traditional society, and lack of response to it. So therefore, Moshe Isserles is trying to see, well, maybe we can find some justification for them, because otherwise we have to regard all these Jews as sinners. And we don't want to regard them all as sinners if we can help it.
Yeah, and that's what I found really fascinating in his opening paragraph, because before he actually launched into the topic itself, he had some introductory sort of meta comments he was being very cautious, and he knew some concerns going into actually dealing with the issues in a sort of a more minute detail, but sort of from a broad perspective. At least for me, that's what I found fascinating, that he was very careful.
Yeah, and he says this is, he's following in a long trail of early rabbinic authorities that if you can, you want to find some justification. Mm-hmm. The problem is that, as we'll see, this is Rabbi Moshe Isserles, you don't want this justification then to be used by other people who were not drinking non-Jewish wine. So how do you walk
that fine line?
Walk that fine line, and that's what the responsum is about. Now, one other thing it's important to mention is, remember, we're not dealing with a time where you can go to the supermarket and buy bottled water, even drink water from your tap. Water was not, people didn't want to drink it. It was not really thought to be safe or healthy. It was dirty. So there was I guess you'd say, strong pressure for people, especially travelers, to drink wine. And that's what led to this. The key argument is the notion you mentioned that we're not dealing with wine that's used for libations. And he goes into the halachic argumentation back and forth. There is still the question of intermarriage, like I mentioned, but he does point out that there are other issues. For example, bread. We eat bread prepared by the non-Jews, even though there was opinions not to. And he concludes that since today there's no fear of them offering these as libations, therefore. He says that we can find with difficulty, we can find a justification. There's other reasons, perhaps, that if the non-Jews are not really involved in it, in any libations, therefore, if they touch the wine, we know it doesn't forbid it, but this is their wine themselves. They said that there was a claim made that if they touched the wine, it wouldn't forbid it. So he's going one step further, and he ends his arguments. We don't need to go into the Halachic details.
You're welcome to go. If you
okay, well, that's the major argument that I said. He acknowledges, first of all, that this is not something that you can find earlier rabbinic sources to permit. The most you can permit, for example, is if you have wine and a non-Jew will touch it. We're not going to say this, then you have to get rid of it. But the idea that you can buy wine and drink wine that is produced by non-Jews, we don't have this anywhere else. But then he tries to argue, as I said, moving on from this idea that it's not used for idolatry, that just like there's permission to eat bread that non-Jews make, even though there was an idea you shouldn't do it, so too, he thinks that because of chaye nefesh, the terms he used, because basically people need it. It's viewed as
it's essential.
As necessity. It's essential, exactly. And it's very difficult, he says, to hachshir hayeno, to actually traveling. How are you going to find kosher wine? He says there's nothing for them to drink. Ein lahem lishtot. This is all they can drink, but just these wines. And therefore, he says it's different in the bread, because the bread officially, non-Jewish bread, was permitted by the sages, but he still thinks that the argument is there. And he does raise the issue of marriage.
I do want to go back and point out, this is Jewish drinking, that they only had really wine to drink.
Yeah.
Which is pretty fascinating. I don't know if that's a specifically Moravian thing or
in medieval times, we know that they were there were the arguments that the same arguments exist in medieval times, but we know that they were very stringent on this, and they did not take this step.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far, featuring Professor Marc Shapiro. I want to give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Professor Laura Lieber on taverns in the Talmud. Here we go. What is this term even that we talk about, this tavern? So I mentioned earlier this phrase Beit Mishteh, drinking house in Tannaitic, earlier rabbinic literature, but we have this other term about 10 times, Beit Kube, a house of casks of, right? So this is an interesting one, and it has really two sort of uses, very broadly speaking, right?
One is that it appears to be a category of a facility, we might say, sort of like a tavern. It's a house of casks. So it could just be sort of a place that people would go to where all the kegs are kept, and sort of easy access to the party supplies. But it also shows up as a place name.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Professor Lieber. I hope you come back for that. And now back into this episode featuring Professor Shapiro.
He raises the issue of intermarriage, but he doesn't think, he gives a halachic argument to see why we shouldn't be bound by that with the change in circumstances if we assume they're not going to be using it for libations. But then he says, I'm not coming here. He says, don't rely on what I'm saying. I'm not coming here. He uses the phrase to be matar sheretz, to make something non-kosher kosher. And he says, I say it very explicitly. All I'm doing here is to give, he writes, ksat panim hatir, try to find some justification, but not to rely on it. In other words, what we're saying is that these people don't regard them as sinners, as heretics, but no one else. He says, especially any other place who doesn't follow this leniency should not follow it. And anyone who does start to break this law, he says bad things about them. You're violating the rabbinic laws, and anyone who violates them is chayav mitah, deserving of death. So he's trying to walk the line here, but he's saying that this is a possible justification. Now, this becomes significant later, even before we continue with Moshe Isserles, because in the conservative movement, when they come out with a responsa, Rabbi Isserles Silverman permitting non-Jewish wine, and he cites for Moses Isserles. To which Rabbi David Novak replies, this doesn't make any sense, because Rabbi Moshe Isserles is explicit that this is only an ex post facto justification under difficult circumstances. It's not meant, and he specifically says no other communities should use this. Even without Moshe Isserles, Rabbi Isserles still could have used the logic he presents there and turned it on its head to say, well, this should be even ab initio. The advantage of all this is that we should regard them at best, these people, at worst, I should say, as what he calls shogegim.
Mm-hmm.
That
inadvertent sinners.
Inadvertent, that they're relying on this thing, which is really not the best. But he says, there's what they have and what to rely on. And even if we disagree, at the best, we'll say, well, they're mistaken unwittingly because they're relying on a position which at least we could find some justification for, even though it's difficult. So,
yeah. I mean, he does. I mean, one of his arguments is to say that maybe possibly you could give a sick person some, maybe some of that.
Well, that's later. Once we assume it's okay, he thinks that you can be lenient if someone's sick, even if there's no danger.
Yeah.
But then that's even moves further, and that's a more conventional ruling than just he's offering a justification of people, otherwise pious Jews. We're talking about Sabbath observant, regular observant Jews, because that's all you had in the pre-modern communities, who started drinking non-Jewish wine.
Yeah,
it's a phenomenon of our history.
Yeah. So it's this ex post facto justification that he provides is, I guess, is not taken kindly afterwards, right?
Well, I would even think that perhaps the people who censored his writings might have thought that Moshe Isserles would be happy we censored him, precisely because they might have justified it by saying if he was around today, he'd see that despite what he wrote, people would be inclined to, as Rabbi Isserles does, to actually use the responsum to justify further violation of this law. So I'm speculating here, but the reason for removing the responsum in two separate printings, different publishers, was because of a fear that this would lead people to do exactly what Moshe Isserles was worried about. They would read it and read this responsum and say, well, you see, it's not so bad. It's not so terrible. Justification can be offered. Maybe I won't drink this at home, but if I'm on the road and this has practical implications. So much so that when the responsum, after it was censored, later rabbis didn't even realize they saw references to this responsum. They thought that it couldn't be authentic. It must have been put in by various critics. The Chai Yadrim, Avram Danzig, actually, who knew about this responsum, was convinced it was put in by some troublemakers, heretics, because he couldn't believe it. Wow. And and it only was put in again in the edition published by Rabbi Asher Siv in 1971. This edition published in Jerusalem. But look, the responsum is cited; it's quoted by so many people. So they didn't know it was authentic, other than a few. But the idea of you wanted to remove it because of what this could lead to, and perhaps it could have led to things like that. We know, for instance, in other countries as well, they did not drink kosher wine and they drank non-Jewish wine, I should say, and they would have been all too happy to see such a responsum justifying them. So
it sounds almost like that there, look, in the language that he used, he was very clear he's not to be relied upon, from a Lechachila perspective, from a ab initio perspective. But it sounds like these later rabbis, certainly the people who censored this particular responsum, were concerned. And it also sounds like people really, certainly in those places, in those times, were very willing to be drinking Gentile wine.
Yes. Well, for instance, in Italy, they drank Gentile wine. Into the second half of the 20th century, Rabbi Professor Toaf from Bar Ilan, his father was the chief rabbi of Rome, Rabbi Toaf. He told me that in his family, as all the other rabbinic families in Italy, even in the 20th century, they drank non-Jewish wine. One of the greatest Halachic authorities, Shmuel Katzenellenbogen in Venice, he permitted it. And so in Italy, it had rabbinic authority. Wow. Other places, we have references to rabbis who permitted it. We don't have really their justifications, but this was a practice, and you could make a very good halachic case for it based upon the idea that it's no longer applicable because it's not used for idolatry. The problem is you can make the halachic case, but the halachic sources don't say this. it's sort of like an independent halacha case you're making, which the conservative movement was very happy to make that, but traditional poskim could not go that far. There's a rabbi named Coronel, and he was a traveler, came from Eretz Yisrael. He wrote a sefer called Zecher Natan, and he says that if you're in Italy and you see them drinking this, don't rebuke them. That's their practice. So he's also not arguing ab initio, but we know that there were rabbinic figures in Italy. It was a dispute in Italy.
Oh, really?
Rabbis who opposed this as well. But we know that it was done, and we have evidence in other places as well of the masses, not so much the rabbis. Italy is the only place I know where you really had rabbis on board with this.
Yeah, well, there were, what I found fascinating in your book was various rabbis permitting Gentile wine. Which
I give a couple here and there, but we don't really have a rabbinic culture that permits it, except for in Italy. You had a partial rabbinic culture in early years, and by the 20th century, according to Professor Toaf, this was pretty standard. But Italy is a bit of a, I don't want to call it reformist, because there's no reform in Italy per se, but they were doing things that would have been regarded as reform elsewhere. So, for instance, they had organs in synagogues played by non-Jews, which in Western Europe, that becomes a classic example of reform. But in Italy, it just was a sort of evolution. And also, I should say, you didn't have the greatest rabbinic figures in the 19th and 20th century in Italy, and that could have led to the development of certain leniencies in these areas.
So I love in your book, reading about these different, wasn't there a commentary on the Mishnah that said something about this as well?
Well, there's a commentary on the Rush. It's called the Kabbalah Netanel, and just right in the middle of it, he has a responsum in which it's very conventional. But in the Kabbalah Netanel, they're just right in the middle. He says that today it should be it's no problem drinking from non-Jews. Now, that's not a halachic text. It's a commentary text. Yeah. So you have to. It obviously is trumped by his responsum. But the fact that he throws that out, I also mention Rabbi Yosef Messas. Messas, who was a chief rabbi of Haifa, but a rabbi came from Meknes in Morocco, has many, many unusual ideas. And he also argued that it wasn't, it shouldn't be an issue, I should say.
Yeah. Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. If you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode. Getting back to the censorship aspects. So, I mean, I just thinking about the censorship. I'm really also curious, generally, what drives censorship? I imagine it's an anxiety about, with this, it's about contemporary practice, even when it was centuries ago, but even the centuries following the publication of his responsa, it sounds like there was a rabbinic anxiety towards people reading this and putting potentially these things into practice. Right? That's
always the case for censorship, is that you're worried that people will, often it's the masses, but I wouldn't say per se in the case of this the masses, because they're not reading responsa, but you could say there's a Talmudic expression, rabbis who haven't served the greater rabbis very well enough. You don't want to have the option out there. That's what motivates the censorship, that you'll have second-level rabbis making decisions on their own, especially on a matter that's so significant, wine, which we constantly need.
It's not it doesn't pop up irregularly.
Yes, but that's the theme of the book throughout. You're always going to have these issues. Yes.
Yeah. So I found it particularly fascinating that you had mentioned specifically this Gentile wine issue being, a censorship issue that was one of the most famous ones. It happened to be a wine and drinking one, and especially as you mentioned, the way that he writes about it, there really wasn't much to drink in these places, except for wine. I mean, even the water wasn't so drinkable. So It's just such a fascinating intersection of both Jewish drinking and of censorship.
Also, because wine became a big issue. There was cherems put on people who drank wine. There were special blessings made for people who abstained from drinking this wine. The Maharal of Prague speaks a lot about this. Non-Jewish wine assumes such a demonic character among certain rabbis that there even becomes a practice not to look at non-Jewish wine. So at the same time, you have these leniencies I discussed in the chapter as well. You have extreme stringencies when it comes to wine, because at the end of the day, wine, that which is exactly what the sage just spoke about, that opens the door for intimacies with the non-Jews. And so certain rabbis in Italy perhaps were not so concerned about this, but other rabbis were very, very concerned. But you get a sense, I mentioned in my book on page 98, that he has a Misha Berach, a special Misha Berach prayer for those who abstain from non-Jewish wine. The fact that you have to have a special Misha Berach shows you that people were inclined to violate it, so therefore you're going to praise the ones who are not. Now today we don't have such an issue because we have all sorts of good kosher wine, but in those days you see already that it was there was an inclination. People had this, not an evil inclination per se. It was just it was a hard commandment, a hard halacha to follow, especially when you were traveling and you couldn't find real, water to drink of healthy water. So that's why you give a special Misha Berach for this, because it shows that people were really extending themselves.
Yeah. It's amusing to hear about sort of the opposite direction. This, this extra emphasis on avoiding Gentile wine.
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of in response.
Yeah.
At the same time that people were being lenient on it, as a way to strengthen the prohibition, you move in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, thank you so much, Professor Shapiro. This has been a really fascinating and insightful discussion, and thank you so much for sharing these insights. So thank you.
Pleasure being here, and good luck on the podcast.
Absolutely. And is there anything you want to promote aside from this book that we've been focusing on Changing the Immutable?
Well, the new book isn't out yet, so we'll leave it at that. The Changing the Immutable.
What's the new book?
New book about on Rav Kook, and hopefully it will not be too long till it sees the light of day.
Okay, wonderful. In the meantime, people can still read your content you keep coming out with on the Sfarim blog, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. I always find it fascinating. So I imagine listeners of this show may find it fascinating as well. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Shapiro, and L'chaim.